Hey, Okira mentioned it in his welcome, but I want to remind you, or maybe give you some more encouragement, to be part of our Holy Smoke Barbecue in 2 weeks on a Saturday. Who would have a barbecue in the middle of summer in Florida, right? Well, we are. It's going to be great. There'll be a lot of shade. There's going to be bounce houses, some fun things for the kids. There's going to be some things, kind of low-impact activities for the adults. Just a time to get together and really no agenda other than enjoying each other's fellowship. So sign up on the app or check out the table there in the foyer, but we want everyone to be there. It's always fun when we get together, so plan on that. This morning, we are continuing our series looking at some short stories that Jesus told. And I hope that this series has been as encouraging and as convicting for you as it has been for me. You know, we go back and we look at these stories that we all know so well. But I think it's important to revisit these stories because there's so many layers to them. And even though we really feel like we know them pretty well, they're just so very good. So we're going to take a look at another story that Jesus told. And strangely enough, or not so strangely actually, this story deals with money. You might not be aware of the fact that of the 38 parables that Jesus told, 16 of them dealt with money or material possessions. Why did Jesus talk so much about money and material possessions? Because he knew how important it was for us to view what we have, wealth-wise, possession-wise, through a kingdom perspective. It's kind of like the father who came home one day with a Band-Aid on his elbow, and his little girl asked him, "Why is that Band-Aid there?" And he said, "Well, I had some blood drawn today for a life insurance policy that I've taken out." And his daughter said, "Well, what's life insurance?" And he said, "Well, you know, Daddy loves Mommy and you and your little brother so much that in case maybe something should happen and Daddy had to go to heaven sooner than expected, the family would have $500,000. Little girl's eyes kind of knitted and she put her head down. He thought, "Oh no, I've made her cry." So he knelt down and put his arm around her, and she finally looks over at him and says, "Is that $500,000 a piece, or do I have to share?" You know, it doesn't take long for us to start obsessing about money, does it? And it doesn't take long for us to start imagining what we might do with a whole lot of money, even when we're small, even when we're young. Maybe that's why Jesus talked so much about money. In fact, the only thing he talked more about than money was the kingdom. Now, the short story that we're going to look at this morning actually is in response to a question that Jesus has asked. In fact, he's interrupted. Jesus is in the middle of teaching, and he is interrupted by someone who asks him a question about an inheritance. Strangely enough, Jesus isn't talking about money in the context. He's not talking about family. This guy just kind of blurts out this question. Have you ever been with someone and they've asked a question and it has nothing to do with the conversation that's going on? That's what's happened to Jesus right here. This guy shouts out a question, has nothing to do with the conversation that Jesus is having. We're in Luke chapter 12, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Again, if you read the previous verses, Jesus isn't talking about money at all. He's not talking about family at all. But this guy kind of basically tells Jesus, "I don't care about what you're talking about. I care about my inheritance. So tell my brother to split the inheritance with me." Now, I don't know exactly what's going on between these two brothers, but this is a guy that wants Jesus to straighten his brother out. And before we start getting too judgmental, I bet most all of us can think of someone in our lives that we want Jesus to straighten out, to make our lives a little bit easier. So there's a little bit of this guy in all of us, okay? But Jesus isn't going to be the arbitrator here between this man and his brother. In fact, he is going to confront what Jesus is convinced is the real issue with this man's heart. Jesus replied, "Man," which, by the way, Jesus doesn't do very often. Read the Gospels. Not too often does Jesus say, "Man." Maybe he's a little bit frustrated. "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you?" Then he said to them. The man asked the question, but Jesus talks to them. "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Notice Jesus replies not to the man, but he talks to them. He talks to the crowd. Obviously, Jesus believes that what I'm about to share here, you all need to hear this. You need to be aware of it. So he says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, which is another way of saying, watch out, stop aggressively trying to capture more, grasping for more. Jesus sees beyond this man's request. Watch out. Be on your guard. Because Jesus knows greed is a very dangerous thing. So he warns us to watch out for it. Be on your guard. And the reason is, one reason is at least, greed is one of those things it's really easy to see in someone else. It is really difficult to see it in ourselves. Now think about it. When's the last time that you asked God to, kind of be aware of, watch out for my spirit of greed? When's the last time you thought of guarding your heart against greed? Now we talk about guarding our heart against, sexual immorality or guard my heart against lust or against anger. When's the last time you asked God, guard my heart against the spirit of greed? It's a recent survey that 89% of Americans responded that America as a culture, Americans as a people, were too materialistic. 89% of Americans believe that we as a nation are too materialistic. Same survey. Same people surveyed, same people responded, were asked, how many of you need more money right now? Guess what the percentage was of people who said, I need more money? 89%. The exact same percentage who said, we're too materialistic, but I need more money. I'm telling you, this thing just sneaks up on us. That's why we've got to watch out. Madeline Levine is a psychiatrist who spends her life working with teens of wealthy families. And she wrote in her book, The Price of Privilege, this: America's newly identified at-risk group is preteens and teens from affluent, well-educated families. In spite of their economic and social advantages, children of affluence experience among the highest levels of depression, substance abuse, anxiety disorders, and unhappiness of any group of children in this country. It's kind of amazing. Even the data shows that having a lot of stuff, having a lot of possessions is one thing. Quality of life is something else completely. And of course, there are times when we are vividly reminded, what life is really about and what is most important to us. Now, you're looking at biopsy reports, or you're thinking about a loved one who was involved in an accident, or even if you're holding a newborn child, your child, your grandchild, you realize, okay, life is about a lot more than just what I have and what's in the bank account, but it's really hard to keep that in perspective. And Jesus knows this. So, now we're ready for the story. Verse 16, and he told him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. It's interesting, in this story, this man is not dishonest. He's not a thief. He's not mistreating his employees in any way. In fact, anyone, especially anyone in our culture, would say that this man has no moral failings. He's a very successful man. He's simply building bigger barns because he needs more room for all of his stuff. He's had a great year. But according to Jesus, God says that man is a fool. Now, God doesn't do that very often in the Gospels either. Not very often that God calls someone a fool. Why does he call this man a fool? The answer is in the punchline that Jesus gives. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God. Jesus says, it is foolish to have our wealth, our possessions, our stuff, and not try to figure out how I can be rich toward God and use those things in order to be rich toward God. More about that in a minute. The challenging thing about money and possessions, though, is it's really difficult to see God through them. Most of you probably know this. For hundreds of years, the only difference between a plate of glass and a mirror was silver lining. That's how mirrors were made. You took a piece of glass, you put a silver lining on the back, and immediately you can't see through the glass anymore. All you can see is a reflection of yourself in that glass. My point being, when we add a silver lining to our lives, quite often it makes it difficult to see God. Because all we really see is a reflection of ourselves and all we've accomplished and all we've amassed and how smart we are. That's why Jesus says, watch out. Be on your guard. And did you notice how self-absorbed this man is in this story? You can go back and count how many times I, me, myself, mine is used. 12 times in 3 verses. This man is just consumed with himself. Look what I've done. Look what I have. Look what I have planned. Also, there's no one else in the story. This story is a little bit unique with Jesus because there's one person in the story. There's no wife. There's no employees. There's no friends. There are no enemies. There's no one else. And more than a dozen times he talks to himself. He plans with himself. He celebrates with himself, parties. He even congratulates himself. He is completely self-absorbed. There's such a temptation to just see ourselves when we look at the things that we've been blessed with. John Ortberg once said, when you trust in the power that belongs to riches, it's the only power you possess. But when you trust in the power of God, you're in touch with a different order and a different magnitude of power. So the question becomes, how do we watch out? How do we guard our hearts against greed? Well, I think we learn from Jesus. So let me share with you a couple takeaways from this story. The first is this. We need to recognize the lies. We just need to be aware of the lies the world is feeding us, and also in our own, the way we're processing things. Here's one of the lies. More is going to fill me up. This guy thinks that if he has more, he's going to be merry. In fact, that's what he says. I'm going to eat, I'm going to drink, I'm going to be merry. But your money and your stuff will never fill the hole in your soul that only God can fill. Full barns does not equate to a full heart. Here's another lie. More is going to guarantee our future. The more I get, the more safe my future is going to be. In fact, this guy has years' worth of stuff stored up. But that's no guarantee that he's going to be around to see it or to enjoy it. There's a story that I came across, supposedly a true story, about a woman who was married to a millionaire in India. Multi-millionaire, very successful man. The man passes away, and the woman eventually marries her chauffeur, the man who had driven the family around for decades. And now he has become a multimillionaire by means of marriage. And the chauffeur said, it's sort of amazing to me. For decades, I thought I was working for him. Drive him to his factory every day, drive him home. Turns out, all those years, he was working for me, because now I have his wealth. More does not guarantee our future. It's a lie. Here's another lie. More means more for me. It's all I, me, and mine. Jesus said this man's mistake is he is looking only at himself. He's not even considering how he might be rich toward God. And by the way, have you ever noticed that you do not have to teach your children to say mine? You don't have to teach your children the concept of ownership, right? It's one of the first things a child learns. Mine. This is mine. We don't have to teach our children to say mine. We do have to teach our children to share. Grasping comes naturally. Letting go, that takes some learning. Jesus is teaching us, is leading us into letting go. Which leads to the next thing when it comes to guarding our heart, and that is we need to acknowledge our anxieties. We need to be honest with ourselves that there are some anxieties surrounding this thing of wealth and possession. Jesus tells a story about a man who is possessed with this spirit of greed. And look at the very next thing that Jesus says. Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore, what's it there for? He's going to tie the story he just told into what he's about to say next. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Then he says in verse 32, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Jesus follows up this parable, this teaching about being rich toward God with our possessions. We're talking about worry. Why? Because he knows that quite often the root of greed is worry, anxiety, insecurity, fear. In fact, those verses following the parable, Jesus uses worry 4 times. He uses the word fear once. There's this worry and there's this concern kind of wrapped in fear, like I've got to have more. I've got to hoard. I've got to save. I've got to collect. I can't share. This has to be for me because it's just me. Who else is going to look out for me? I'm not going to have enough. I got to have more. Jesus is calling this crowd, he's calling them to take a pretty big step of faith. He's talking to people, many of whom, probably most of whom, really are living day to day. They're living hand to mouth. Not like us. And yet we have the same anxieties as those people had. I got to have more. What I have now could never be enough. I've got to look out for me. I've got to focus on getting me situated. Which brings to another thing when it comes to guarding our heart, and that is we need to learn to see God the way Jesus sees him, as a father. One of the ways to deal with anxiety, one of the best ways to deal with anxiety is to see God the way Jesus sees God, as a loving Father. To anyone who's terrified about tomorrow, Jesus will tell you God's already there. Verse 30. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. Interesting. In the Old Testament, God is referred to as a father 14 times. 14 times in 39 books. In the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels, Jesus refers to God as a father over 160 times. What's one of the things that Jesus did when he shows up on the scene? He teaches us how to better view God as a loving father. He elevates the status of God in ways that God wants to be known as Father. He wants us to see Him and to trust Him as a good Father. And by the way, speaking of a good Father, the best fathers don't always give us what we want, but they give us what we need. Now, if we're all perfectly honest with each other, most of our anxiety about possessions and wealth isn't wrapped around things that we need. Most of our anxiety is wrapped around those things that we just want. Young guy goes one weekend to spend a weekend with his grandparents on their farm. It's a very modest farm, very humble house, not a lot of comforts at all. But his grandparents were so in love, so happy, so fulfilled. And the grandson said to his grandfather, Granddad, I got to tell you, I wish I could live my life with the same kind of peace and joy that you have, the same kind of fulfillment that you have. I wish I could do that. The grandfather said, well, I can tell you exactly how to do that. Well, tell me, I want to know. And he said, just tell me everything that you want, and I'll teach you how to live without it. Seeing God as a Father has something to do with how well we live our lives, even when we don't get all the things we want, but are supplied with all the things that we need. And then finally, I think guarding our hearts involves seeking the kingdom with all we have. Jesus says in verse 31, but seek His kingdom. What's it mean? What does it mean to seek the kingdom? It means I'm asking the question, what does the King want? Not what do I want? What does the King want? Seek His kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. One of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're being very honest with ourselves, when my neighbors, when my friends look at my life, when they look at the things that are important to me, when they look at how I spend my money, when they look at how I use the things that I've been blessed with, would they deduce that guy's got a kingdom focus? That sister, she is seeking the kingdom with all that she has. Would they see that in our lives? Listen, we're all working hard, okay? We all work hard. Who are you working for? A guy by the name of Kenneth Ulmer tells a story about years earlier when he went to college. He goes to college and he takes a class that he only showed up to class 2 days. He showed up the first day and the last day. Because he knew that this professor based the entire course's grade on one essay that to be turned in at the end of the semester. So he figures, I'm just going to go the first day, I'll get the syllabus, I'll write a really great essay, turn it in on the last day. He was a smart guy. He was a hard worker, and he thought he could do that and stay busy doing other things, so that's what he did. He shows up on the first day, he gets the syllabus, and no one sees him the rest of the semester until the last day. He turns in his essay. It was back in the day when you couldn't access a portal to see what your score was or anything like that, so he actually had to go back to the professor's office to pick up his essay, get his grade. Outside the office, there's a stack of essays. He thumbs through, finds his, opens it up, and he sees a whole lot of red marked on his paper. He turns to the last page, and the professor had written a note. Excellent writing, clear line of thinking, flawless logic applied, beautiful graphs, powerful illustrations, not the assignment. F. Not the assignment. That story hits home for a lot of people. And it's going to hit home for a whole lot more one day. Because there are people who are very gifted, very talented, doing things, good things, working hard, getting up early in the morning, staying up late at night, working so hard, accomplishing so much, writing their papers, building their barns, only to be told, not the assignment. You focused on the wrong thing. You failed. You're a fool. You know, I started this series by telling you that Jesus is the master teacher. There's no teacher greater than Jesus. Here's the amazing thing about Jesus. When you fail his assignment, he lets you take it again. Amen. You get another chance. That's why Paul would write in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." This morning, how are you defining what it means to be rich? What definition are you using to define success? What would it mean for you today to seek his kingdom with all that you have? And maybe most importantly, do you understand the assignment? Are your efforts going in the right direction? Because there is a final judgment. There is a payday someday. Am I being rich toward God? With all that I've been given, with all that I've been blessed. Am I being rich toward God, or am I being a fool? We've got a song that we're going to use, a song of encouragement this morning. If we can help you in any way, pray with you about something that's going on in your life, we would love to do that as a church family. You can meet us here at the front of the auditorium. Let's go ahead and be standing.